My name is Christina Kwauk. I am a fellow in the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. And I lead our girls' education work. I manage the Kinda Global Scholars Program, and I also lead our research on girls' education. So when I think about education diplomacy, we think about not only the sort of the individual interpersonal skills, but also kind of the cognitive and the non-cognitive skills that an effective leader might need to have. So on the interpersonal skills, this is things like being able to take another person's perspective, being able to understand another person's stakes in a particular issue, but at the same time being able to recognize different power dynamics between yourself and a person that you might be having a conversation with, or the different people, the different stakeholders in a room discussing an issue. So when we think about that sort of scenario, when we think about power dynamics, we need to think about how do you create relationships of trust, how do you create relationships, period, and then particularly for issues that might be particularly contentious at a policy level or at a community level. But at the same time, we think about social-emotional skills, like having empathy or compassion, having tact. At the same time, being able to determine what to say, what not to say in a particular scenario, given the particular stakeholders in the room. So a whole range of different kinds of skills that we might say are educational diplomacy skills are kind of fall into the buckets of interpersonal skills, socio-emotional skills, cognitive skills, and non-cognitive skills. We think about the different types of spaces in which policy negotiation or programmatic negotiations might be taking place around girls' education. It's not just about access to education that we're talking about, but about creating opportunities where girls have the opportunities to learn the 4 different R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, as well as rights. So her rights to an education, for example. And so this means that oftentimes the stakeholders that you might be engaging with might be fundamentally against or opposed, or even not even think about the relevance of a girl's right to education. So in those sorts of contexts where maybe a girl's education advocate might be coming in really from an angle of sort of a feminist approach, this kind of approach might lead to backlash or just to no space for conversations and dialogue. So in that kind of a case, education diplomacy might really come into play, because then it's really about thinking about those relationships, thinking about power dynamics, thinking about stakeholders' perspectives, and thinking about how do you then come to common ground when at the very fundamental level of the issue that you're discussing, be it girls' access to education, if that very fundamental piece is of contention, how do you reach a common solution? So in that sort of case, really thinking about how in a scenario where not everybody's coming together believing the same thing, I think diplomacy skills can really come into play. Okay, so I think when we're talking about education diplomacy and its role in creating innovation or just creativity in general, I think this is actually an area where much more strategic action, strategic thinking needs to go into play. I don't think it's something that necessarily just emerges because one is taking an educational diplomatic approach to something, because it's very easy, especially when you're amongst a room of stakeholders that don't see eye to eye on a particular issue, to then fall back into easy policy solutions that might not necessarily be based in evidence, that might really kind of touch hearts and minds, but not really the underlying causes or the underlying barriers that are preventing girls from accessing education. So, so to give you an example, so when we think about adolescent girls and sort of the moment at which puberty hits and she starts to have her period, and we think, if we try to see this as a particular tipping point in a girl's education lifespan, what might be some ways or some policy approaches to addressing this? I think at a sort of a popular level, it's becoming increasingly a go-to to say, let's provide reusable menstrual pads. Let's provide these pads and these, dispensing machines, or let's teach girls how to create their own reusable pads. And at a policy level, I think once we get over some of the cultural taboos that entails, the pads sort of becomes this thing that people focus in on, but maybe not necessarily what are the underlying sort of gender norms that have created taboos around girls and menstruation that then lead to either her dropping out of school or lead to families saying she needs to get married now, she's now a woman, So I think it's very easy in situations where you are dealing with stakeholders who don't see eye to eye with you to fall into some solutions that might be more policy sexy, but might not actually get at the underlying things that require creativity and innovation. So I think that is a space where we need to be a little bit more careful. And when thinking about how do you sort of garner the skills around education diplomacy for transformative outcomes for girls, we really need to think about the long game and not the short wins. So in my line of work, I work primarily with different girls' education leaders from around the world. And I'm lucky enough to be able to travel and meet some of these individuals and their policy stakeholders from time to time. And on these trips, I see my primary role in sort of the strategic thinking, futures thinking, systems thinking area in terms of, providing the sort of the dialogue space, a space for dialogue, to really kind of bring some of the larger global trends thinking into conversations around local policy solutions for girls. So when we think about some of those skills that would enhance a girl's education leader's ability to effectively negotiate different kinds of policy solutions, I think thinking about strategic thinking, how is a particular stakeholder's constituents going to see a policy solution, but then how does that policy solution then affect other industries or other sectors? So how do we bring in sort of a multi-sectoral approach to our thinking around girls' education? So it's about I see my role as kind of bringing in some of that, some of the cognitive aspects of education diplomacy into the space.